you very much for joining us. Turn yourself on.
I got myself on. You guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. First thing you're going to do is assure me that I don't look any different, right?
Recognize you.
All right, okay. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. And before I get started, looking around the room here, you can see all the hats and folks that don't have hats. It's obvious there's a whole bunch of veterans in here. And so what I want to do, anytime I make any remarks to anybody, of course, is thank you for your service. Wherever we were, whatever we did, we all gave in service to our country, and it's something we can all be very, very proud of. So thank you for your service. As I go through my remarks here, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. We'll try and deal with them as we go, okay? But to start, I was in the Navy from 1968 to 1973, and I don't know whether it was because I watched too many episodes of Victory at Sea or lived under the approach path of the Philadelphia International Airport, but I was always interested in flying. So I went to college. I joined the NROTC at Villanova University in Philadelphia, and when I graduated, I got assigned to flight school in Pensacola, Florida. I went down to what they call primary flight school, which consisted of about 6 weeks of ground school and then 10 to 12 flights in this thing here called the T-34 Mentor, which is the first aircraft I've ever flown. Soloed in it, did some acrobatic training, just kind of got used to what it is to fly a naval aircraft. After primary flight school, I got assigned to basic jet training. I was very fortunate. There was a selection process involved there. I wasn't that good, but I was lucky enough to get into the basic jet training. And I got assigned to a base in Meridian, Mississippi, NAS Meridian, called McCain Field. And I learned to fly the T-2 Buckeye. Went through basic familiarization in the aircraft, essentially soloed, got some instruction in some instrument flying, and some night flying, and some formation flying, two and four plane formation flying. When you're talking about formation flying, anybody here has flown an airplane, and I imagine some folks have, but for those who haven't, when you start off in formation flying, you kind of start off like, here's your lead aircraft, and you're over here, and you're kind of like this, all over the place, But after a couple, 3 odd days, you're able to kind of tuck in there pretty well. And it's a lot of fun, really enjoyable aircraft to fly, and really had a great experience in Meridian. After I finished the formation training in Meridian, I got sent back down again to Pensacola, Florida, flying the T-2 again for basically air-to-air gunnery training, where we would fly the aircraft and try to hit a banner being towed by another aircraft. And when I had that experience, the conclusion I rapidly drew was I was never going to be a fighter pilot because I couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. I mean, it just wasn't in the cards. We also went down there, though. We completed our first carrier qualification, okay? And what was my first carrier qualification like? Well, I can tell you what my first carrier qualification was like because it's a very vivid memory, but not particularly clear. I remember taking off from Pensacola. I remember at some time being on board the USS Lexington, and I remember landing at Pensacola. In between, I made 4 arrested landings, and I don't recall one of them. Okay, not a one. It's just so much is going on. Your head's spinning. People are flying around. I just don't remember the landings, but I made them so successfully. I was successful, and as a consequence, I went from Pensacola, and I got assigned to advanced flight school, advanced jet training in Kingsville, Texas, where I flew an aircraft called the F-9 Cougar, okay? And the F-9 Cougar is basically a variation of the F-9 Panther that was featured in the Bridges at Tokari. It was just a swept-wing version. And the aircraft was affectionately known as the Lead Sled, okay? All right. What that meant was, hey, look, it's about an 8,000-foot strip down at Kingsville. And in the summertime, it could get really, really hot. And the aircraft wasn't the most heavily powered aircraft. So basically, the pearl of wisdom was that basically if you have the Cougar and you run off the end of the runway, it's no problem because all you're going to do is bounce across the prairie until you come to a stop, and then you hop out of the aircraft. So it's known as the lead sled. Down in Kingsville, I flew two variations of the F-9. This is the F-9, the TF-9, or the training aircraft, and I would, through the curriculum down there, I fly either in the front seat or in the back seat. Basically, the back seat flights were all instrument training type pops. In the front seat, of course, you had an instructor in the back who was, Jim, don't do that. You know, Jim, be calm. Jim, no, it didn't normally go that way. It was, what the hell are you doing, Higgins? You know, so. But that was a TF-9, so that was a lot of fun to fly. But the really cool thing was, the first time I got to fly an aircraft that was not designed as a training aircraft. So I actually got to fly in the F-9 Coover, straight, what they call a straight aircraft. It was really, really a lot of fun. Now in Kingsville, what we did was we basically expanded upon all the training I received in the T2, made it a little more sophisticated, a little more of a challenge. But essentially, it was, in addition to what we learned down in the T2, they also gave us some instruction in bombing, gave us instruction in air-to-air combat maneuvering, which again, not being a fighter pilot, I didn't do very well in that. Did the best I could, but not so much. Did some road recce training, just go out into the country and fly along and just pretend you're looking for targets on the ground. But the big challenge in Kingsville was I had to get an instrument rating. I had to be able to show that this 22-year-old kid could take off in an aircraft and navigate and fly it from one point to the other in all kinds of weather. So it took about 19 flights, and the big scary flight was it was called the check flight on your 19th flight. You had to be able to show people that you could do indeed fly that aircraft in any kind of condition that you would encounter. Not a really easy thing to do, but most people get through it, and so it's no big deal, I guess, about it, but quite a bit of a challenge there. But I have to be honest with you, in terms of naval aviation and the experience of naval aviation, until I got to Kingsville, it was just, can I do this? Can I learn to fly this airplane? But in terms of the profession, I guess, and the experience, I got my lesson in how serious a business it is. Because in Kingsville, in the months I was there from essentially, it was March through August of 1969. In those 4 or 5 months, we lost 4 classmates. One guy took off, rolled inverted, crashed the aircraft, got killed. Another guy flew into the ground on a bombing run. Another guy flew into the ground at the base in the night landing pattern. And a 4th guy, all guys I knew, flew into the water off the ship on carrier qualifications. So it really came across as, hey, you know, I got to be serious about this. It's just not a lark. It's something you got to pay a lot of attention to. But nonetheless, everybody persists. Everybody wants to do this thing. And so everybody kind of kept on going. And so I ended up getting designated a naval aviator in August of 1969 when I got my wings. And after that, my first assignment was to Naval Air Station Lemoore in California. I was assigned to VA 127. VA 127 is what they referred to back then as the instrument rag. In other words, basically it was the squadron on the West Coast that took pilots, either pilots coming out of the training command or pilots returning to the fleet from shore assignments. They would go out there and give these pilots instrument refresher training, okay? And I went out there as an instructor, as a Lieutenant JG, okay? So it's kind of an interesting assignment because I'm a Lieutenant JG and I'm providing instrument instruction to much more senior aviators, lieutenants, lieutenant commanders, okay? I got the assignment because I'd done pretty well on the instrument curriculum there, but it was sort of somewhat of an intimidating experience. And as you can imagine, me being a junior grade officer, running into some senior grade officers, it kind of had a couple of interesting experiences. On one occasion, I walk into the briefing room and my student is a commander, okay? And I walk in and he's just sitting there waiting for me to show up. And I walk in, and as soon as I walk into I look back there, I know that guy. I don't know where I know him from, but I know that guy. And you just can't figure out who the guy is. And so we sit down, and he's a complete gentleman, and go through the brief. And the whole time, I'm going through the brief of the flight, and I'm sitting there saying, who in the heck is this guy? Who is this guy? That confusion continued until we go out to the aircraft. It's a two-seated aircraft. I'm up in front. My student is in the back. And we have what they call as a plane captain. And that's the guy, or now gals today, who are responsible for getting the aircraft ready for a flight. And so we go out there, and we're manning the aircraft. And we're going out there. You have a bag where you have your helmet, and you kind of, carry it out there. You give it to the plane captain, and he hands it off to, just kind of holds on to it till you man your aircraft. And so I get into the front, trying to get ready for the flight, and my student in the back, finally the plane captain climbs up this ladder and gives him his flight helmet bag. And only then did I realize that he pulled it out. The helmet that comes out is a uniquely, kind of like a Wyoming cowboy, yellow helmet. My student was the former flight lead of the Blue Angels, okay? So I'm not sure how much I taught the guy, but it was kind of, sir, a lot of discretion being exposed in terms of how I approached it. But he was actually, again, in terms of credit to the guy, an absolute gentleman. I probably made a lot more mistakes than he did, but he was very, very gracious, okay? However, about 6 months or maybe 7, 8 months after I got out there, VA 127 became what they referred to as the replacement air group for the A-4 squadrons on the West Coast. In other words, people coming from the training command who are going to go out to A-4 squadrons, or people coming back to fly A-4 squadrons, would go through this replacement air group, and they would go out and be familiarized with the aircraft before they joined their squadrons. So when 127 became the replacement air group for the A-4s, I went from being an instructor to being a student again, okay? And in that context, we had the opportunity to fly 2 airplanes. We flew both the TA-4. I had to go through the same instrument instruction program that I had been instructing. And then we had a whole bunch of other different kind of flight training we went through that we would use this aircraft again, a straight A-4F. This is an A-4F, basically the same aircraft I flew in the fleet, okay? The RAG training was, again, just an expansion of what we had done in the Advanced Training Command with a lot of different variations, but a lot of fun kind of flying. It was really the first time where we had really, really fun flying. That included practicing both conventional and nuclear weapons delivery, included air-to-air refueling, both day and night, and it included simulated nuclear delivery training flights. The A-4 initially was designed way back in the 50s as, believe it or not, a one-way nuclear delivery platform. Essentially, pilots take off, they got a big bomb underneath the airplane, go off to a target, and then you had an invasion route, and you basically ejected out of the aircraft and hope you got back to your countrymen, I guess, basically. Never had to do that. But we did a lot of practice, simulated nuclear deliveries, and what they were referred to as sandblower hops, okay? And what we would do, we'd take off out of Lemoore, climb up maybe 15, 20,000 feet, and then get out over the ocean somewhere, out over the mountains. And then we would descend down to about 200 feet, okay, to run this route over to our target. We were using charts and the terrain features to try and go. We'd be going down there theoretically at about 200 feet at about 360 knots en route to the target. A lot of fun, down in the weeds, great, okay? But, and whatever you've done in the service, you know there are protocols and there are rules and there are ways of going about doing things, okay? Well, in the sandblower routes, you're supposed to go down and stay at 200 feet, okay? However, amongst the guys back then, the notion was, hey, partner, you don't have a hair on your patootie there unless you're down at 50, okay? So the idea is you get out, you start off, and then you start easing on down to about 50 feet. Well, you're going across country at that speed, at about 50 feet, up and down and over and under and, whatever it is. you got to pay a lot of attention. So what we did was we trimmed up the aircraft, in other words, set the flight controls so that if ever we got distracted, you know, the airplane would start coming up, right? Well, I learned how important that was because I think on my next to the last Stambler flight, I was zooming across the desert out in Arizona, and I was approaching a ridge line. You know, I was feeling pretty good, pretty confident, everything was going great. And I don't know, maybe there was something off to the right that was pretty. I wanted to take a look at it. I don't know what it was, but I got distracted. And before I knew it, as I'm approaching this ridge line, I come back and I feel the aircraft descending. Okay. Grab the stick and just yank the daggum thing back. Went across that ridge line at about 10 feet. All right. We had something called a radar altimeter in the aircraft that sent a signal down to the ground, and that's where it kind of bottomed out. But I was, you know, confident I'd get across the ridge line, but 10 feet is a little too close. So you got to pay attention to this stuff. But the big deal in the RAG was night carrier landings, all right? I know John back there is an A6 driver. He knows what I'm talking about. And, you know, basically, you know, the Navy is a great propaganda outfit, you know. You may not realize it, but I'm an impossibly cool guy, okay? I'm impossibly cool. I mean, maverick, I mean, we're all that way, you know. But honestly, at nighttime, around the ship, nobody's cool, okay? I mean, basically, you're out there. I was by myself. I knew John had a BN in there anyway, and Phil, one of our, a member of VVA with 1071 down in Lakewood, was a bombardier navigator. We all know you're out there, and it's black, black, and more black. I mean, basically, you can't see anything. Maybe a few lights out there on the horizon. But all you've got to do to get you back on board the ship are the instruments in the aircraft and some strings of lights off the ship. And so it's something which you can't describe. I don't know. Would you agree, John? I mean, you really can't. And it's just, but the important thing is, nobody has swagger at nighttime. Okay, so we completed the night carrier qualification. And when I got finished with the RAG, I got assigned to the VA-164 on board the USS Hancock. And that's the Hancock right there. The Hancock was an Essex-class carrier, what they referred to as a 27 Charlie class carrier when I was on board. She actually served in the Second World War. In the Second World War, attested to the fact right there, she was stricken by a kamikaze, all right? And this is really kind of bad. You know, you're talking about the ship you flew off of, and this is back in the Second World War, and it's such, you know, it's so long ago. But World War II carrier, stricken by a kamikaze right there. If you take a look at your old history books and you take a look at some of the battles of Okinawa or wherever it is, and they'll have carriers lined up, you'll see the Hancock out there, okay? Basically, in between her services in the war, Korean War, up to that point in time, they modified it to include an angled deck. Okay, before that was a straight deck. And what that was done, of course, was to ensure that if an aircraft came in and wanted to catch one of the four wires, which started like about here up to about there, if you didn't catch the wire, you could do what they call a bolter, power up, and go right around again. Okay. Before that, as in Bridges at Toko Ri, you end up crashing in all the other aircraft. When I got on board her, she had 3 A-4 squadrons, kind of right up through here. And we had 2 F-8 squadrons, the F-8 Crusader, the last of the gunfighters, the last fighter aircraft that actually had a cannon up here on his nose wheel. I mean, it's something which all the other aircraft, the F-4s, didn't have any guns. They had to kind of attach guns to the aircraft to have a gun. The F-8 fighters took great pride in that, okay? Basically, that was the Hancock. When I joined her, I had 2 cruises on board the Hancock. My first cruise was from December 1970. I joined the squadron, we joined the ship on Christmas Day, okay? So it was a hoorah, okay? It went until May of 1971. And in both cruises, I flew the A-4 Skyhawk, the A-4F. This here shows a typical combat configuration of the aircraft when we flew it. How many folks have seen Top Gun? Everybody, I guess? Okay. Well, the A-4, just to give you an idea of the operational characteristics of the aircraft, was the aircraft that Jester and Viper flew, okay? Struck terror in the hearts of Maverick, okay? That's the A-4. That's the aircraft I flew. It shows a typical combat configuration. We carried 6 500-pound bombs, 3 on each wing. And we had a 220 millimeter cannon situated there in the wing root. And we had about 200 rounds of 20 millimeter cannon fire. And this thing up here, up in the nose, is part of my education when I went out to the A4. Before I went out to Lemoore, I thought that was a gun or a cannon, but that's not a gun or a cannon. That's an in-flight refueling probe. If you ever were flying around and you're getting short on gas, Navy would have aircraft up there with what they call a buddy store, and they could extend a drogue, and you could stick that thing into that drogue and get some gas just to make sure you could have a safe flight and return to the ship. Okay, so during that time, basically, we had 2 kinds of missions over Vietnam, essentially. We operated from Yankee Station, which is basically just a geographic fix here, and the overwhelming majority of our missions were interdiction missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay, I'm sure you guys have all read about what that was, and it was basically kind of a, I don't want to say it was an I-25 coming from North Vietnam through Laos down into Cambodia into South Vietnam, because the Ho Chi Minh Trail actually moved traffic along, okay? It wasn't stuck there as you kind of get on 25. But we had 2 primary missions. The first were interdiction missions where we'd fly from Yankee Station up here. Then we fly down across South Vietnam or into South Vietnam and into Laos, and we join up with Air Force forward air controllers, Air Force FACs, who would be orbiting. I mean, these guys were crazy. They were orbiting all over here, down at low altitude, trying to find targets for us. So it would be vectored on in to somewhere by a command structure situated down here in Saigon. We'd link up with a FAC, and then they would direct us to the targets. We'd launch an attack trying to take out trucks, bridges, supply depots, whatever it is that they would point us to. That was our typical mission, okay? However, depending upon circumstances, the missions would vary. And sometimes this sounds kind of, we didn't really appreciate these missions because when you think about it, it's a little bit ridiculous in a way, but sometimes you take off the ship and you fly into the clouds. En route to the target, you're into the clouds. Coming back to the ship, you're in the clouds. So consequently, in those situations, we in the A4 was what we referred to as a day visual flight rule bomber. We really didn't have any radars, didn't have a whole lot of sophisticated systems on the aircraft. It was we would roll in and drop our bombs, kind of what they used to refer to as iron sight bombing, okay? So in those circumstances where you're in the clouds and you can't see anything, you got to adapt. And so what would happen is oftentimes we take off in those circumstances and there would be some sort of, as I mentioned, a command center down here in Saigon, maybe up in Da Nang, some sort of air base, but there would be this radar center, and we would contact the radar center, and we would be flying along. We'd take off in either what they call sections of 2 aircraft, divisions of 4, be flying along, and they would vector us. They would direct us to what they refer to as, well, I guess the easiest way of saying is just a tactical aid to navigation fix. Places like Da Nang had these systems where you could, on a 360-degree radius, you would be able to mark off the distances on these radii, and Saigon would direct you to, say, like the 270 radial off Da Nang at 50 miles, okay? They'd send us off there, would be information, and they would say, mark, 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 and we just drop our bombs, okay? Don't know where they went, don't know what happened, but that's sort of one of the game plans we had. Otherwise, we also had circumstances where, how many Air Force people are here? Okay, you guys know the Air Force had everything. The biggest budget, the biggest fleets, the biggest aircraft, and the more advanced technologically aircraft. So oftentimes we would go over and they would have specially equipped aircraft. One case I remember, there was an F-4 that I think may have had one of the first primitive kind of GPS systems. and we would go out and we'd be vectored to that aircraft. This would be in the daytime too. We'd join up on that aircraft, not only our ship, we launch, every cycle they would call it, 20 bombers, I guess. We'd have our 20 aircraft link up with this F4 with a special system. You might even have 2 or 3 other ships with similar numbers of aircraft joining up on that aircraft. And we, again, would join up, fly formation. When they gave us the mark, bingo, drop our bombs, and I guess we pretend we were a B-52 for the afternoon. I'm not sure. But the most rewarding flights, and this is something the A6 drivers never had to worry about. They were very sophisticated, had radars and do all this sort of stuff. We occasionally would fly off the ship at nighttime, good weather conditions, and we'd join up with a FAC flying over the trail, okay, at nighttime. And the aircraft that were flying then were C-123. I think they were Cargo Masters, Sky Masters or something. Maybe you guys know what I'm talking about. And they'd be flying over the trail. And, when you're over the trail, even as dark as it is down there, there's always pinpricks of light you can see, all right? And so what they would do is they would throw out a flare, okay, land on the ground. We'd be in communication. They'd say, hey, you see my flare? We say, well, tally-ho, there it is, yeah, right there. He says, then they would say, okay, you see that light to the southwest? Roger that, tally-ho. And he says, okay. And this is the precision system that we used to work under sometimes. They say, okay, draw a line from my flare to that light. Roger, okay, draw a line. This is all mentally, of course, He says, go half the distance, okay, and then at a right angle, go half that distance up and put your bombs there, okay? So you do what you got to do. You roll in, you don't see anything, it's all dark, you get to 5,000 feet, you pickle and you pull off, that's how it worked, okay? So, however, they were our typical flights. They were actually more the exception. Most often it was with a FAC. But, however, between February 8th and March 25, actually, what I wanted to mention, let me see here real quick. Oh, yeah. When we were flying over the trail, this is typical of the defenses we encountered. The Viet Cong North Vietnamese had 23 millimeter and 37 millimeter anti-aircraft guns that could reach maybe 5, 10, 15,000 feet, and you didn't want to get hit by one of them, okay? So that's what the defenses were during the interdiction missions on the trail. However, between February 8th and March 25th in 1971, we also flew in support of an operation called Lam Son 719. Anybody here heard about that? Way back there, at least one guy. Okay, 2. Okay. And Lam Son 719 was, in the latter part of the war there, was an effort by the Vietnamese Army to basically help us, instead of interdicting the flow of supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they wanted to go in there and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the idea was they were going to go from wherever it was over here into Laos, and right around there is a town called Chepone, T-C-H-E-P-O-N-E. It was kind of a transportation hub on the trail. They were going to go in there and capture it. Okay, so we provided support for the North Vietnamese in that operation. And what we would do again in that circumstance, we fly off the ship, sections of 2, divisions of 4, link up with a FAC, and we try to support whichever way we could the South Vietnamese Army in their operation. It went back and forth for about a month and a half, I guess it was. The typical combat load, again, was what we normally carried. However, since we were doing something besides simply interdicting the flow of supplies, we were actually dealing with bad guys and tanks on the ground. In addition to our iron bombs, we occasionally carry what they refer to as cluster bombs, okay? And what a cluster bomb is basically a big container that has a whole bunch of little bombs in it, okay? This is the CBU-29, actually it's 58D. We carried the CBU-29, but it looked pretty much the same. And what these things would do, you would drop them, and as they descended, they would open up like in a clamshell, and they would disperse all these little bomblets down on the ground. The CBUs that we dropped anyway had little bombs like hand grenades, and they would disperse. And when they landed on the ground, they were kind of in these overlapping circles, and they were used against infantry positions down on the ground. Above and beyond that, we also carried something called the Mark 20 Rockeye, which is what we used against tanks. Any kind of armor that the bad guys had on the ground, we would drop these Mark 20s, and they had these little bomblets in there. I mean, they look harmless. They almost look like something your kids are playing with, like darts. But those things were engineered so that they could penetrate armor, okay? And so we had some tanks or some armor kind of vehicles down on the ground. We dropped Mark 20s, and if you drop them in pairs, they cover the size of a football field. So hopefully any armor coming in toward the South Vietnamese forces will be taken out, okay? So that was the first cruise. Final flight on that cruise was the 3rd of May, 1971. And then back then, I'm not sure how it was in later times, but we went back to the States for a 6-month turnaround and came back out for a second cruise. And my second cruise was from January 72 to September of 1972. And when we came out, basically the operations were the same as they were before. We were flying interdiction flights on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was kind of, come on, it's the same old stuff. What's the big deal here? However, the North Vietnamese, and anybody in this room who was over there knows for a fact, those guys were always trying to take over the South. I mean, it was 68 was way, there was something before that, there were mini Tets in between. They were always trying to conquer South Vietnam one way or another. So they decided in what became known as the Easter Offensive, they decided to invade South Vietnam. And what they did, unlike before where they had the guerrillas, the Viet Cong, they launched conventional forces across the DMZ, up here, down into the Central Highlands, and down into the Mekong Delta down there. I mean, a massive, massive invasion of South Vietnam. So that occurs, and the strategy is to say, hey, forget about interdicting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We got to switch gears here. And what the Hancock did first off was we went out and we provided support to the South Vietnamese Army, principally first off in an area down here called An Loc Ninh. Okay, there was actually An Loc is here, Loc Ninh is a little bit closer. I just read the other day that Loc Ninh historically is where the Viet Cong kind of had their massive headquarters, was down there in Loc Ninh. The critical thing about An Loc and Loc Ninh was about 60 miles from Saigon. So very critical operation down there. And so we provided support to the South Vietnamese Army in defending their country down there. The operations were very similar to what we encountered up in Lam Son 719, join up with a FAC and attack the bad guys with whatever ordnance we were able to carry. So that's what we did, at least at Hancock. And they probably operated maybe 2 to 3 carriers out there at one particular time. I'm not sure which ones were there with us. I know I saw somebody, Kitty Hawk was out there, I think, yeah, we saw it. Flew off the Kitty Hawk, 4 hops. Stopped me from getting 400 traps on the Hancock. Couldn't believe it, okay? I was, what the heck? All right, okay. So basically, though, what we did, we shifted from An Loc to Loc Ninh, and then we went up north, okay? And not only did we go up north, but everybody went up north. Air Force went up north, Navy went up north, Marine Corps, I think, flew some missions up north. And what the strategists did in order to help, avoid conflict between the Navy and the Air Force, I mean, it's a big country, but not that big, they broke up North Vietnam into what they referred to as route packages, and then they divvied them up amongst the Navy and the Air Force. And the Air Force was responsible for Route Package 1, Route Package 5, and 6 Alpha up here. And the Navy had Route Package 2, 3, 4, and 6 Bravo up through that area there, okay? And better to get back here. And for us, for our purposes, what that meant for the Navy is that we would operate from sort of south of this town here called Vinh, which was the site of the Vietnamese Antiaircraft School, okay? So you had to be very careful whenever you went into Vinh, okay? So then up to Hanoi, kind of the Army, the Air Force and Navy kind of split up a little bit up to the Chinese border, and we included the port of Haiphong. Typical flights up there were two kinds. We launch what they refer to as road reconnaissance missions, and we take, again, sections of 2, divisions of 4 aircraft, and we would fly from the Hancock into this area here, just looking for targets of opportunity, day or night, okay? Again, in deference to the guys who flew the A-6 who could penetrate Vietnam at 200 feet, rocketing along and really hit the target. Our day missions are okay. We could find trains and trucks and things like that on the ground, but at nighttime, what we used to do, we used to go into North Vietnam, 2 guys and 2 airplanes, and we would be equipped with a flare. And so we would fly along and we'd pop a flare, and then the wingman behind the lead be, okay, that. Not the most effective use of personnel, nor the most successful mission. But we did it because that's what we were asked to do. However, as the war went on, more often than not, we engaged in what were referred to, let me see if I can find it. Actually, I don't need to do that. I'm missing a slide. Well, I'll explain. Okay. I'm missing a slide. Okay. We would engage in what they're referred to as alpha strikes. In an alpha strike, we had, on the Hancock anyway, we had 3 a day, okay? And what that involved was a strike group of about 30 airplanes, kind of all occupying the same area of the sky. You'd have 16 to 20 A-4 bombers, okay? You'd have 4 what were referred to as flak suppression aircraft, A-4s again. And then you have 2 to 4 what they referred to as iron hand aircraft. What they were, of course, the bombers were the bombers. The flak suppression aircraft were probably A-4s equipped with maybe not iron, hard bombs, the 500-pound bombs, maybe Rockeyes. They would be attached to the group till about 2 minutes out from the target, okay? And they would disperse to get ahead of the strike group, so that when the strike group got in the area of the target, they would hopefully be able to suppress any guns in the area. And we all had a pretty good idea where the anti-aircraft gun emplacements were. Similarly, the Iron Hand aircraft were aircraft equipped with an AGM-45 Shrike missile, an anti-radar missile. We got over north, and I'll describe it here in a little bit. Much of the defensive equipment the North Vietnamese had was radar controlled, guns and or missiles. And so the Shrike aircraft, or the A-4s were equipped, the Iron Hand aircraft they would also depart the strike group about 2-3 minutes from the target, and they'd sort of orbit the area, and they'd wait for radars to come up, and then they would attack the radar to prevent the radar from operating the guns and the missiles that they might throw against us. We also had some fighter escorts, okay, and they were called TARCAP on our ship. And what that meant was essentially they were the target combat air patrol. And their mission was to kind of accompany us and escort us, and should any bad guys show up, MiGs, they go off and intercept them, because oftentimes what the North Vietnamese did back then was just get a MiG, launch it, send it towards a strike group. Nobody knew who it was going to go after, and there was a propensity on the big deck carriers, not on the small deck carriers. Big deck carriers, people would just drop their ordnance to avoid getting stricken by these MiGs. So that's what the TARCAP was for. Then we also had, as we went into these different target areas, we would have an electronic countermeasure aircraft orbiting off the coast, and they would be monitoring the enemy radar and trying to disrupt the operation of the radar systems, okay? Now, I got things a little bit backwards here, but basically when we went up north of the Alpha Strikes, the Alpha Strike was designed to eliminate the North Vietnamese war-making capability. What that meant was we went after the big targets, the critical infrastructures, their petroleum facilities, transportation hubs, air bases, military facilities, ports, transportation hubs. They were the targets for the Alpha Strikes, okay? And that's why we ended up doing it that way. So Free a day, continued almost to my last flight, which is the 14th of September 1972. And in the, oh, I'm sorry, wait a minute, I forgot to talk about the defenses. Okay, when we were down south, they were just guns shooting up in the air, okay? You go up north, much more sophisticated air defense system. I think it was deemed to be the most heavily defended airspace in the history of warfare, okay? So it was a delightful place to go to. But what they had up there...
Jim, how many planes did you lose?
Oh, we didn't lose that many. We lost about 6, I guess. You know, we always attested to the fact we were just, excuse my French.
Six from the air.
Shit hot. What?
6 from the squadron? Your squadron?
Oh, no. 6 from the air wing in terms of combat losses, maybe 8. And then we had about 6 operational losses. That's always part of naval aviation. You're always losing people off the ship anyway, but I think we had about 8. 2 or 3 guys KIA and the rest were POWs. Okay, but the defenses we got up there were radar directed. Basically 37, 57, 100 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, radar directed. It could go much higher than the ones down south. Let me see. There's a 57 right there. Okay. You notice they're Soviets. Okay, so we know where the North Vietnamese got their supplies. Okay. We also had surface-to-air missiles. You know, the kind that John McCain shot him down. They would go at 3 times the speed of sound, and you never wanted to run into one. Okay, you wanted to avoid them as best you possibly could. And then theoretically, we had TARCAP and fighters up in the air, and they were again designed to eliminate the threat from the MiGs that would come in. I can't tell you how many times. Sometimes I wasn't on a strike mission. I'd be out on a tanker over the ocean or something, listening up, and can't tell you how many times I heard other carriers and their strike groups dealing with MiGs, okay? We never dealt with MiGs. And I tell you what, we went down to the fighter squadron and they said there's a reason why, because we're the best damn fighter pilots in the world and they're not going to come up against the Hancock. Okay? So that was, my last flight was on the 14th of September 1972, and I had roughly about 250 combat strikes in those 2 cruises. So that's it. Any questions?
The big effort you just talked about, where you went north, that was part of Nixon's plan to bomb the North Vietnamese to the point where they pursued for peace.
It was sort of the prelude.
Right.
Okay. What it was, and actually I'm listening to a book right now. It's pretty cool. I mean, Nixon was exasperated, totally exasperated when the North invaded. So he took the operation up north, and then all the stuff we were doing was having an impact, but the North Vietnamese were just obdurate. They would not compromise. And so then, I think over the Christmas bombing campaign, that's when they sent the B-52s in. Yeah.
And speaking of B-52s, we have a B-52 commander in Cephalou, Moyer right there.
All right, there you go. Buff. Arc light flights. Fly any arc light flights? Okay. Yeah. Well, he can explain what they are. Any other questions?
I understand each of your landings on a carrier is rated.
Yeah.
Could you explain the rating system and how it's adjusted for weather, seas, etc.?
It's not adjusted for weather or sea. Okay. I mean, basically what it is, you come around, you come down to the ship, you brake, come around, and you just turn towards the ship, you come out into, I don't know how far out, maybe half a mile behind the ship when you kind of line up, okay? And basically, you got to make sure the aircraft is on what they call the center line. Okay? This is what they call center line right here, okay? And you got to fly the airplane so that you're always on that center line, okay? And what you need to do with that is you got to always crab a little bit because the ship's moving away from you, but you want to make sure, as best you possibly can, you land on the center line. And then when you're coming down, there's an optimal landing speed, okay? And there's a light on the outside of the aircraft and the lights inside the aircraft. And on the ship, right about here, there's what they refer to as a landing signal officer, okay? And that guy is watching your airplane coming in, and the optimal deal would be, if you're fast, you have a red light. If you're slow, you have a green light. If you're on speed, it's yellow. So they're watching you. If you can, a perfect one would be on speed all the way on down. You're coming down about 700 feet a minute, okay, about 140 knots, something like that, 160 miles an hour or so, 140 miles an hour. So you always want to be on speed, and you always want to be on glide path. And what that refers to is there was a landing operating system situated right about here, and it projected a light beam after the ship. Okay, when you rolled out, you kind of roll the aircraft flat. You want to be on speed, you want to be on the center line, and then this beam that's projected is one that they refer to as a Fresnel lens. This yellow light goes up and down, and there are 3 green lights on either side called datum lights. And the perfect approach is that yellow light is right in between the green lights. Okay, so basically, they're the 3 elements. The only time I almost got shot down, I had an okay, perfect pass back at the ship, okay? Once in 400, okay? But basically what you do, this guy, the LSO, is watching you fly the airplane with all those elements and how you correct it. And depending upon how well you do, you'll get a grade. Okay, no comment is everything's perfect. Okay, some variations. Your nose is rough. You're kind of right of center line. You're, whatever. Or fair. And then no grade, which is always, they had these boards in the ready room, and the no grades were red. And then there was another category called a cut pass. Okay? And a cut pass involved the pilot coming in and landing about here, and then doing what they call a taxi 1 and getting the number 1 wire up there. So they would watch all those variables, and then you would be graded throughout the cruise. Every line period you were graded, and everybody competed. I mean, not like I'm going to beat you, but everybody wanted to fly the perfect pass, and so everybody tried to do as well as they could.
What would you see at night as you're approaching that? You can't really see the carrier. So.
Basically, what you see is that the center line here, there's a string of lights, and then back down here, there's a set of what they call drop lights. And at nighttime, you don't see the ship, you see lights. And so basically, you're kind of radar directed at nighttime. They bring you down, it's up there. And so if you're coming down and you're on center line, then the lights go. If you're left of center line, just the optical effect is it kind of gives you a hint, go that way. If you're on the right side, it says go that way, okay? So that's what you see in the center line. Then you see the lens, okay? That beam. And I think there was some really little lights on the landing area here. And then up here, the ship also is operating. It might have some, white light at night destroys your night vision. So the ship would have the island up here with some red lights on it. You might see that out of it. But when you came back here in about 200 feet and half a mile, you saw nothing. And inside the aircraft, there was what they call an angle of attack indicator that tells you I'm slow, I'm fast, or whatever. So when you're landing at nighttime, angle of attack indicator, center line, and the ball. Okay, and it goes like this. Ball, airspeed, lineup, ball, airspeed. And then as you get closer, it's ball, airspeed, and then after that it's ball, until you land. You hope to land, then you.
Don't spot the deck.
You do not spot the deck. What that means is and I don't know anybody who did it, honestly, because people would come in and they'd try to land the airplane. And ordinarily, if you try to land the airplane, you're going to break it, or you're going to miss the ship, you're going to go around. And so what happens, those are the parameters, notwithstanding. And the LSO is out there to kind of let you know what you're doing. It's reassuring, because sometimes you'll be flying in when you're talking about the deck going up and down. I mean, that ball, you're coming in, you're saying, I'm flying the perfect pass. Going down. And then the guy says, okay, 415, keep it coming, deck's pitching. What's that mean? Well, that means you're perfect, but because the ship's going like this, the ball's going, notwithstanding anything you do. So the LSO says, gotcha, keep it coming. Okay, so you just keep on flying, and they monitor you until you land, depending on the circumstances. So day or night, that's how that works.
So what do you do about port or starboard drift?
Pardon me?
What do you do about port or starboard drift?
I mean, the ship going that way? Ship doesn't do that. What happens is, as I mentioned, the ship has a heading, and that center line is at an angle, so the center line's always drifting, and that's why you essentially crab a little bit into the, if the ship's going, the center line is this way, like 270 degrees, then effectively, and you don't look at any gauge and say, this is what, you just do it, and just kind of, all right, I'm on or I'm not. And so you kind of compensate that way in terms of the drift. Next question. Okay. It's taken a lot more time than I thought.
No, well, Jim, thank you so much
Okay.
for joining us.
My pleasure.
And here's the...
Oh, thank you. Okay. Did I mention the DVD?
Yeah.
Mention
Oh,
it?
no, go ahead. Mention it.
One last thing, if you're interested, I got about a 20-minute DVD that I put together from when I was flying, just trying to show my folks when I got back. They always thought when I went on a cruise, it was just lying in the sun, So I wanted to show them what I did, and it was just kind of, it's not the best quality, but it gives you an idea what the operations are like. If you're interested, I got a DVD we can play. It takes about 20
We'll
minutes.
take a